Hello, good evening. We're pleased tonight to welcome former Secretary of the Navy and Governor of Mississippi, Ray Mabus, to campus this evening. I had a chance to do a podcast with Secretary Mabus, and he has lived and he has created a lot of history in his life, and we're lucky to have him today. This Wednesday, Laura Rosenberger and Jamie Fly of the Alliance for Securing Democracy will be talking with Kimberly Dozier about the Russian government's efforts to undermine public faith in democracy. On Thursday, we'll welcome former Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price in conversation with Dean Catherine Baker of the Harris School of Public Policy. And next Wednesday, May 2nd, we'll host a panel discussion on the surge of women running for office in 2018. I think this will be perhaps the story of 2018, not just the women running, but the women at the polls. You can find out more about all of our upcoming events on our website, politics.uchicago.edu. As always, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that will be in the center aisle. And as usual, we'll give priority for the first three questions to students. Just the customary reminder that questions end in question marks. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. The restrooms are on the first floor. Here to formally endorse our speaker is Owen El Rifi. Owen is a third year from Rye, New York, studying political science and public policy with a concentration in international security. During his time at the IOP, he has served as a Fellows Ambassador and as a Sargent Shriver Fellow for Leadership in Public Service. He is now one of the IOP's house managers, and he leads the civic engagement group Leg Up. Please join me in welcoming Owen to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. We are named the Institute of Politics, but our mission statement seeks to inspire and cultivate the next generation of political and public service leaders. Our guest tonight, former Secretary Ray Mabus, is the embodiment of a public service leader, and he is certainly an inspiration. Throughout his long and distinguished career in the service of the public, he has served as a Mississippi State Auditor, the Governor of Mississippi, the U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and finally, the 75th Secretary of the United States Navy. In every role in which he served, former Secretary Mabus has made strides to better his state and his country. In 2009, former Secretary Mabus was nominated by President Obama to become the Secretary of the Navy. In this role, former Secretary Mabus tripled the length of paid maternity leave, pushed through ambitious projects that would cut the Navy's reliance on non-renewable energy sources to 50%, advocated for and oversaw the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and traveled to over 150 countries and territories across the globe to develop America's overseas relations and to honor the troops serving there. It is an honor to have former Secretary Mabus here, and we thank him for his lifetime of service to this country. Moderating the discussion tonight is Chicago Council of Global Affairs non-resident senior fellow Cecile Shea. At the Council of Global Affairs, Chicago Council of Global Affairs, Ms. Shea focuses on security and diplomacy and advises the Council on its Next Generation project, which brings together accomplished undergraduate and graduate students to work on innovative solutions to the problems that plague our society. Before turning to the private sector, Ms. Shea also had an impressive career in public service, including working as a U.S. diplomat for over 20 years, and has spent years more advising embassy and consul officials across the globe. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Cecile Shea and former Secretary Ray Mabus.
Well, welcome to Chicago. Welcome here. You've had such a great career as a governor and as an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, as the Secretary of the Navy. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you what you think the three biggest security threats facing our country are and will be for the next 20 years.
Well, the immediate security threat, I think, that we've got is the administration we've got. It's internal. Our word is no longer trusted. We govern by impulse and tweet, and it's just not a good way to run an organization. And it's the notion of using our military on a whim, or the notion that we've got a president that calls people my generals. They're not his generals. They're the United States generals. So I think that's one. Now, I'm hoping that's not for 20 years, but I do think that's a big one. The second one is climate change. I think that has the potential to be more disruptive, more harmful, to do more lasting damage than almost anything else that's out there. I mean, from a military perspective, if we don't get a handle on sea level rise, Norfolk is going to disappear, the largest Navy base in the world. It's just going to go away. And it will go away within the lifetime of people alive today. As climate changes and storms get stronger, as people are both displaced because of these storms, because of lack of food, because of the changing climate, instability often follows, and sometimes that's replaced with chaos. And so from a military, from a governmental standpoint, that's a huge threat. And third is the more traditional stuff. I mean, every morning that I woke up, I got to deal with Iran and North Korea, Syria, non-state actors like ISIS, Afghanistan, Iraq. And I think, and then the near peer competitors in military speak, China, the rise of China, the rise of Russia, in military terms and in belligerence and the notion of what they're all about. And so I think that overall, those are the sort of three big ones. You're always going to have some sort of military or some sort of threat to peace, some sort of threat to the nation. They change over time, but climate is an existential threat to us, and I think that one of the things that you do in the military is you don't know what those military threats are going to be. You don't know what the national security threats are going to be. So you just have to have a force that's trained to be flexible, to be resilient, to be adaptable, to face whatever comes at them.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. What is the Navy of the future and the Marine Corps of the future? And the Marines are part of the Department of the Navy, so you were the secretary of both the Navy and the Marine Corps. But we can even enlarge that. Any Air Force or Army folks here today? We'll enlarge that to the whole military. What does the military of the future look like, and what should it look like to respond to the threats that you just enumerated?
Well, the world is becoming faster and smaller and cheaper. The U.S. military is becoming bigger and slower and more expensive.
Yeah, that's not good.
Those are bad trends. I think the military of the future is going to face a lot of things that the military of the past is not. Cyber as warfare, cyber as a battle space, space as another battle space, disinformation campaigns, the social media work that you've seen Russia do already, and then unmanned is. I mean, we're already there in a lot of cases. I was there for the first landing of an unmanned fighter on a carrier. We've got drones today that range from that big to as big as this room, and more you're gonna see that. Now, it's good in a way. It keeps people out of harm's way more, but it also raises real questions about what's appropriate. When can you When can you strike? When can you use unmanned systems to strike at humans? When is a cyber attack an act of war? And you can respond with actual warfare instead of in a cyber area.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that we have needed for about 2 decades now to update the rules of war, the Geneva Convention and other rules governing war, which have not been updated since World War II. And I think part of the reason for that is what you're alluding to, is just the way we fight wars and the capacities that not just the United States, but now any country, because anyone can afford a drone anymore, right? So I feel like we need to get ahead of this, and we're not. I mean, was there even discussion when you were in the Pentagon about the need to revisit some of these issues?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion, but not a lot of progress on actually getting there and making some decisions, because you can really make a pretty good argument that the Russian interference with our election went at the basic thing of who we are, the basis of our democracy, and that's an act of war.
Yeah.
And that it is appropriate to respond in different ways, not just publicly and not just in cyber, but you could respond in other ways. But the notion of the theory, the appropriate way to respond is not kept up with the technology, and I don't think it shows any that it's going to do that anytime soon.
Yeah. What about the use of paramilitaries? I know when you were in the Navy, there was discussion about whether the CIA was doing too much in terms of military-type roles in some places. Is that a discussion we as a nation should be having?
Yeah, you know what the military's job is. You know what they are trained to do, our military is better than anybody in the world at doing the things that they're trained to do. But when you get into this sort of odd, not odd, but different authorities, when you've got civilians from the CIA or anywhere, and even in the law, there are different authorities. I mean, Title 10 and Title 50. The way you think about it, and it's the same thing with our adversaries. When Russia went into the Ukraine, the little green men went ahead, and they were probably military, just with the insignia taken off, but they were paramilitary, they were deniable, they were not the normal military people that you would look for. And so those are whole different avenues of military force. And I think it's appropriate for us to look at using CIA or NSA in cyber or something like that. But we ought to be pretty upfront about how we're using them and what we're using them for.
And possibly have other countries agree to a standard set of rules, which is what we have always done throughout history, and most countries followed the rules.
It's sort of strange to talk about rules of warfare, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That we can't make these decisions by ourselves. There are always going to be outliers. There are always going to be people that are not following the rules. But as long as you've got a sort of a framework that you can work within, you're always better off than not.
So let's talk about this military of the future. We operate under the Napoleonic staff system here. For those of you who don't know what that is, the capacities of a military are divided into 6, these days 8 or so groups. So if you work for the 4, you do logistics. And if you work for the 2, you do intelligence. Militaries need intelligence. But number 1, what is the 1? It is the central thing, the first thing that a military needs. Does anybody know what the 1 is? Close. The 1 is personnel. It used to be called manpower. Actual boots on the ground, people on the ships. So you
know where those numbers came from?
Tell me where the numbers came from.
The 1, the 2, that's Napoleon.
Well, the Napoleonic staff system,
Yep.
That's right. It's the Napoleonic staff system. And all of NATO now follows the Napoleonic staff system,
It
including us.
confused me no end.
Really, when you
took
your commission.
And once I would learn them,
Yeah, it makes sense then. Right?
but then they would keep adding stuff.
That's right.
N99,
Yeah,
NXX.
that's right.
I mean, what
Yeah.
are these things?
Yeah, yeah, they had to create a number for the State Department, so they created the 9. But, well, so let's talk about personnel, though, because this was a matter near and dear to your heart. What does the human element of the Navy or the Marine Corps of the future look like?
Well, number one, and one of the things I worked on the most, a more diverse force is a stronger force, just period. Not diversity simply for diversity's sake, but diversity in background, diversity in geography, diversity in thought, diversity in experience. Because if a military gets to looking too much like each other, if a military begins to thinking too much alike, they become very predictable. And a predictable military is a defeatable military. And so whatever the force is of the future, my basic notion was you set standards for a military job. Those standards are related to the job, so they're not arbitrary.
Yeah.
And once you do that, then everything else becomes irrelevant. If you can meet the standards, it doesn't matter about gender, it doesn't matter about sexual orientation, it doesn't matter about color, it doesn't matter about anything. The only qualification to get a job ought to be the ability to do the job. And so that's why I push for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, for the inclusion of transgender, for opening all roles to women in the Navy and the Marines and across the American military. And so for that force of the future, there just aren't any more jobs in the military or basically anywhere else for strong backs, weak minds. To be a United States Marine now, to be a United States sailor now, it's one of the most technical jobs on earth. And you've got to be highly educated. You've got to be highly skilled to do that. Here's a scary statistic. 3 out of 4 Americans aged 18 to 24 do not qualify for the U.S. military. 3 out of 4.
Because of weight or?
3 reasons: obesity or health, but mainly obesity, criminal records, or they didn't graduate from high school. And so the pool is already much smaller than it ought to be. Yeah. But then once you're in that, you have got to make sure that people come from diverse backgrounds. I mean, I brought back Naval ROTC to Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, but I also established units at Arizona State and Rutgers, the 2 most diverse campuses in the country.
Because of geographic diversity, and I would add religious diversity, has been lacking in the military since the end of mobilization for World War II.
Well, and particularly in the all-volunteer force.
Yes.
That our military was getting to look very much alike. It was coming from the same regions of the country, and it's becoming in some ways a family business. Children go into the military whose parents were in the military, and on down through generations. And you've just got to make sure that there's not a distance between those doing the protecting and those being protected. There's got to be a much stronger connection there. And it's really hard when far less than 1% of America serves in uniform today.
Yeah. Would you support mandatory national service for, say, 18-year-olds?
Absolutely. I think that would be really important. Not military service,
Right.
but national service.
And military could be one option.
Military could be one option. But I think it would help the nation a lot. I also think it would help those 18-year-olds. And I mean, I've got 3 children, and they're wonderful. They're terrific. I think they would have benefited from doing that.
Yeah.
Now, the older 2 who were out of college, each in their own way found ways to serve. But having a national service, I think, I know that when I was in the Navy in the early 70s, I met people that I've never met before and never met after, and got to know different parts of the world, different parts of the country, different types of people in a way that You just don't today.
And I feel like that's what's missing in our society. There are people in America who've never actually met an African American. I mean, when you live in Chicago, you aren't aware of that. There are people who've never met someone who's Jewish. There are people who've never met a Muslim. So they have ideas with no actual knowledge. And I mean, I feel like giving young people the opportunity to work with people from other parts of the country and other backgrounds would.
Well, and you could also make one of the requirements that if you come in at 18 or 19 or whenever you do, that if you don't have a high school degree, one of the requirements is you get one while you're in.
Right.
And you could use other people to be the instructors, to be the tutors of people going through. I mean, we're doing better in high school graduation, but we're not doing great. We still have 25% nationwide high school dropout rate. And democracy is a hard system.
Yes.
It's not easy, and you've got to have highly educated and interested and involved people to make democracy work.
So you tried to bring Mississippi forward when you were the governor there and improve education, among other things, and overcome some of its own history. And what is the future what is the future for some of the states in this country that seem to have not moved forward as quickly as other of the states? I guess that's how I could put it.
Well, if you just look at facts, and I know that may be out of fashion today, but the places with the best educational systems, and I'm talking early childhood all the way through great universities like this one, are the places that are doing the best. The places with higher tax rates are the places that are doing the best. And so, this notion that, okay, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to dramatically cut education or cheat education, and somehow that's magically going to make us all wake up rich and good looking is just wrong. I mean, it's just so bad. And I don't think there are very bright futures if they don't change, if things don't happen. I mean, my slogan running for governor of Mississippi was, Mississippi will never be last again. We were last in every single measurement, educational attainment, but also per capita income, and things like that. There is an absolute correlation there. If you don't do right by education, if you don't do right by early childhood in particular, if you don't do right by prenatal care, if you don't do right about maternal health and about the root causes of poverty and homelessness, you're going to have individuals that do fine, but as a society, we're just not. And, I guess the whole notion of a government and a whole notion of democracy is that we're sort of all in this together. My tax money may go for things that will never touch me, may go for a hospital in Chicago or a highway in Arizona, but it doesn't mean it's not benefiting me. It doesn't mean that if it doesn't happen, my life isn't going to be lessened. And I think that that's one of the things we've really lost. I always thought that governmental service was a pretty noble calling, and that if you did it right and you did it for the right reasons, that you really could make a difference. And I think that there are a lot of people, one of the things that David was talking about, so many people running for office today, that impulse has been awakened again.
Yeah. We've been thinking a lot about what a good company Starbucks has become. People forget Howard Schultz lived in public housing when he was a child. And because the country and the state invested in him, he was able to turn around and build a major corporation and contribute to this country. So I think that that's an example of what you are talking about.
I used to say during my campaign for governor, and it used to irritate my press secretary no end, but I said, if I can do education right, I'll shut down the rest of government.
Interesting.
because that's the one thing
Yeah.
that's going to make a huge difference.
Well, so let me ask you a question. Can we put that kind of money in education while we have a military that costs between $500 billion and $2/3 of $1 trillion a year?
Well, it's all a matter of setting priorities. It's all a matter of what's important. And one of the problems I've got with big increases going in the military, well, I got two problems. One is, to what end? Okay, you're getting a lot more money. Why? What are you going to do with it? And two is, when I got to Navy, we were spending way too much and getting way too little in return. It was, when I left, we had driven the cost of a destroyer down by $300 million a ship, and that's a $1.8 billion ship. We cut the cost of littoral combat ships in half. We bought 10 attack submarines, biggest contract Navy had ever signed. We paid for 9 because we bought 10 at once over 5 years. So it's like having a card, buy 9 subs, get your 10th one free. and we were just paying way too much and getting way too little in return. I mean, the Secretary of Defense in the early 2000s, Rumsfeld, talked about transforming the American military.
Yeah.
My notion was he was talking about transforming public money into private money. Now, defense contractors ought to make a profit. We don't build our own weapons. We don't build our own ships and things. But it ought to be fair from both sides. Taxpayers should be the ones that we look out for, that those of us in government look out for. And that just hadn't been done. And so this large increase, are they going to get their money's worth? And are they going to get their money's worth on what?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still unclear what they're going to spend all that extra money for. And if you don't improve education, if you don't improve health care, then who's going to serve in the military? 3 out of 4 can't do it today. And you're going to make the pool smaller and smaller.
So this brings up one of the things that I think you were a real leader on while you were the secretary, which is this idea that the civilians are supposed to be in charge of the military. The military has a lot of ideas, and certainly the civilian leadership needs to listen to it. But whether you are talking about ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or reforming the atrociously out of whack administrative and budgeting system in DOD, it should be the civilians, I think, was your message. The civilians need to be making those decisions. So can you talk a little bit about civilian control of the military and democracy?
It's one of our basis of our Constitution, civilian control of the military. It's what Washington talked about. That, and when you go around the world, so many countries, their Minister of Defense is
Where's
in
the
uniform.
Where's the uniform? That's right. Sometimes the president wears a uniform.
Yeah, and we are unique in that, and it's a good way to be unique, or somewhat unique in that. And the notion that a military serves the Constitution and not a specific individual, the notion that civilians control the military, is one of the great bulwarks of our democracy. And again, when this president talks about my generals, that's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous trend.
But it takes a certain amount of courage to say, no, you're going to do this, because the buck is going to stop on. So a lot of civilians, I feel like, want to pass the buck to the generals. So they'll say, well, the generals wanted to do this. The generals wanted to keep fighting in Vietnam, right? The generals wanted to do this. The generals wanted to do that. And then they feel like they are absolved of blame. What is your message to politicians about how to work with the military in an effective way?
Well, number one, if you're going to be in a leadership position, lead.
Takes courage.
I've always,
Yeah.
well, I mean, then don't get in the business if you don't. I've always been astounded. People work for years at getting to leadership roles and then refuse to make decisions. They get worried, they get scared, or something like that. And I thought one of the great strengths I brought to Navy was that I had no idea what the issues were. And it had been 37 years since the day I walked off my cruiser and before I came back. And I had contact with people from my ship and reunions and stuff like that, but nothing with the Navy formally. And so I didn't bring any baggage. I hadn't been in for 35 years and developed a way of thinking. And you take a fresh look at issues. And I think when you rotate the civilian leadership, when you have civilian leadership, that's one of the great strengths. Now, you've got to have those career military. You've got to have that advice. And you really ought to listen to it because they have spent that amount of time. But in the end, the final decision has got to be with the civilian leadership.
And then I think your story of some of the generals being uncomfortable. Well, tell us about some of the generals being uncomfortable with ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and what happened in the end. You know, what it was like getting to the final decision.
Well, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think, is one of the dumbest laws I've ever heard of. And it's like Mike Mullen, who chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said we were asking people to lie to serve, which is just wrong in so many ways. But one of the things that I began to notice pretty quickly, because I did travel a lot, and I went to see sailors and Marines where they were deployed instead of sitting back in my office in the Pentagon on the off chance they might come to see me. And I would do sort of hundreds and hundreds of all-hands calls. You'd go to a base, you'd go to a ship, and you just gather all the sailors, all the Marines, and I'd talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'd answer their questions as long as they wanted to. And pretty soon, you figured out what was important to them and what wasn't, just by the questions you were getting. In the whole year leading up to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, when the Pentagon was just tied in knots about it, I got 2 questions about it. Nobody cared.
Right.
Nobody cared in the force. It was a generational thing. And the people in the Pentagon were just eaten up with this. And I quit going to meetings because it was just, you know, they were going round and round and round. And the force didn't care. And you could see it. It was just this big nothing when it happened.
I saw that in PACOM. I mean, the colonels, generals cared, lieutenant colonels. By the time you got down to the captains and the majors, and most of the NCOs, they were like, as long as they're good Marines, as long as they're good sailors, we really don't care. It was just a huge generational gap.
Well, my daughters, who are now 27, 25, and 17, used to look at people or on television or whatever when they were talking about why you didn't need gays in the military. The same way I used to look at people in the 50s and 60s when they were explaining why segregation was a really good idea. You know, it was like, are you nuts? Are you crazy? What's wrong? And the other thing is that people today grow up with their friends coming out as being LGBTQ, when in a previous generations that just didn't happen because of the fear, because of the uncertainty, and so it's just a normal part of life today.
So what's the next diversity? And then we're going to go to questions from the audience. But what's the next diversity hurdle, assuming that we can get past this transgender controversy between the Secretary of Defense and the President? What's the next diversity goal that you can see?
Well, again, it's thought and experience and background and making sure that, I mean, there's a military expression, because every military officer, until you get past 2 stars, is picked by a board. That ducks pick ducks. That
the Brits say clubbable. They choose somebody who will welcome to the club.
Yeah, and they
club.
pick somebody that looks like them, that's had a career like them, and that's what you've got to guard against. And the last story I'll tell is on this segment, because I'll always tell stories, but the first CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, that I served with, Gary Ruffhead, kept a fitness report of a young officer framed outside his office. And this young officer had run his ship aground during World War I, and he'd been court-martialed for it. And his defense was, I was a destroyer captain, and I was supposed to get in as close to shore as possible to support ground troops. I did that. I was being aggressive, just like I was supposed to. I hit something that was not on the charts. I would do it again. That was my job. He was exonerated. His name was Chester Nimitz.
Wow.
And if we had cashiered Chester Nimitz for making a mistake, for taking risk, you know, think of how the war in the Pacific might have been different.
That's right.
And so you want people that are willing to take risk. You want people with different ways of thinking about things. And you want people, you don't want to end a career because of one failure, as long as it was a risk worth taking.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. Thank you very much. Okay, do we have some students who would like to ask questions? Well, I understand that is the tradition. Here we go.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Angela. I'm a second year in the college. My question is, how central do you think American domination of the Pacific is to American foreign policy? And do you see any other countries contending that domination in the future?
Well, I think one of the reasons that Asia has done as well as it has, and the world economy has done as well as it has, is the United States Navy keeping the sea lanes open, particularly in the Pacific, for everybody. And I think that one of the big risks that China takes as it tries to push us further and further out is that they have been one of the main beneficiaries of this. And one of the things that we kept talking to the Chinese about was, we want you to be a great power, but we want you to assume the responsibilities of being a great power. We want you to work with us, not against us. It's a big ocean, and we can do a lot of things together. We can protect that ocean together much better than if we're adversarial. The example I gave when I went to China, they would read their talking points and talk about our intelligence flights and our intelligence gathering ships and how terrible that was. And I said, well, number one, you know where we are, we're abiding by international law, but number two, you must think it's pretty valuable because you sent an intel gathering ship to the rim of the Pacific, the largest naval exercise in the world, every 2 years. And I said, and our response was to invite you the next time, not to try to keep you out. We invited you in. They were complaining about 2012. We invited them in 2014 and they came. Now they also sent an intel ship. I'm not sure if they were gathering intel on us and the other navies or if they were gathering intel on their own navy.
They wanted to shop in the Pearl Harbor PX because I saw all of them there. I mean, but I'm glad that you guys did the right thing. We need to interact with them, yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
That was a good. How important are the bases in Japan then, following up? Because I think that was one of the things she was alluding to probably.
No, I think that forward base ships are just more effective because of the presence I was talking about. Around that's the thing the Navy and Marine Corps give. Around the world, around the clock, being at the right place, not at the right time, just at the right time, but all the time. And one ship forward takes the place of 4 ships back in the U.S. So you operate more, you're present more, and so those bases, Yokosuka, Sasebo, are pretty important to us. But we've got to do it in partnership with the Japanese. We moved 4 destroyers to Rota, Spain, for example. And it's a way for us to have more of that presence, but it's also a way for us to work closer with our friends and our allies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I'm a second year in the college. I have sort of an open-ended question for you. First, I'm interested in how you would describe the sort of dynamics between career military and then political appointees like yourself. And then more broadly, if you can just sort of talk about your day-to-day life as Secretary of the Navy. And I know it was mentioned in the introduction that you traveled to like 150 countries over 8 years. What are the importance of those visits, and what was sort of the work you were doing there?
Okay. Well, one of the things that the U.S. military has been very deeply ingrained is civilian control. And it's not a question, it's not an item of discussion. You know, when you come in, you are accorded your office, it's not you, your office though is accorded the respect and the deference that they give. Now you have some arguments, or intense discussions, I'll put it that way. But end of the day, the military is going to, once the decision's made, is going to move out. They're going to implement it. So, and different civilians take different roles. I mean, some of my predecessors have just not wanted to do it for good reasons, bad reasons, whatever reasons, and they've just returned a lot of the responsibility to the military. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, because under our law and under our Constitution, it's supposed to stay the ultimate authority, but also the ultimate responsibility is supposed to stay with the political people. The reason that I travel so much was for two reasons. One was to see sailors and Marines, as I said. But second was to work with those friends and allies. And I mean, every one of those 152 countries and territories that I went to, we were doing something with. And there's a saying that you can surge people, you can surge equipment, you cannot surge trust. And it was to establish that. I also went to all 50 states because one of the great partnerships is with the American people, and the notion, because when the Navy and Marine Corps are doing their job, they're America's away team. They're a long way from home, usually. And I'll take a little digression. One of the things I traveled to all these states for was to name Navy ships. Secretary of the Navy gets to name every Navy ship. It's a pretty cool job. And so I started naming them at ball games. Because all of a sudden you've got 40,000 people who are invested in that ship. I'm also the only human that's ever thrown out the first pitch in all 30 major league stadiums.
Wow.
So that's a good job. But, and in those ship names, I named it after cities, I named it after states, I named it after Medal of Honor recipients, Navy Cross recipients, but I also named ships after civilians, which is a tradition in the Navy to name support ships after civilians that shared our values. So I named the Medgar Evers, the Cesar Chavez, the Harvey Milk, the John Lewis, the Sojourner Truth, the Bobby Kennedy, the Earl Warren, and the Lucy Stone. And my day-to-day life, I'm not sure there was a normal day. I worked all the time. And, you know, today I get to fly on much larger aircraft. But there are all these strangers on board, and
You have to go through a metal detector.
and nobody salutes, and they are not ready to leave when I am. It's really pretty terrible.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yang, second year in sociology. So Trump administration's national security strategy released last December listed China as one of the biggest threats to U.S. power. And there is a quote like this: China's efforts to build and militarize outposts in the South China Sea endanger the free flow of trade, threaten the sovereignty of other nations, and undermine regional stability. China has mounted a rapid military modernization campaign designed to limit U.S. access to the region and provide China a freer hand there, unquote. So this is a very typical chessboard logic assessment. So I want you to evaluate this quote, and more specifically, where some of the challenges can be solved by improving connectivity, the web logic, and some of the challenges that cannot be solved by this logic and can only be countered by the traditional chessboard logic. And also, where do you see the end game for the U.S. Marine in the near future?
Okay.
Well,
In under 30 words, please. Just kidding.
that may be one of the most literate questions I've
I
ever
know,
been
that's
asked.
true.
And,
Very good.
I think I understand most of the terms, but okay. On that statement, I do agree that it undermines regional stability and it can impede the free flow of trade. So two things, and they're different things, but I think you need to do them at once. Number one, I don't think the status quo in the South China Sea or anywhere ought to be changed by unilaterally or by force. And so building these islands, these outposts in waters that are clearly not theirs, waters that don't fall under any definition of the law of the sea or traditional usage or anything. In fact, the claims are based on a hand-drawn map from nationalist China, the 9-dash line or the cow's tongue or whatever you want to call it. And so I think that countries need to challenge that all the time. I think you need to sail within 12 miles. I think you need overflights just to keep it from becoming the new status quo, just to keep the status quo from being changed by force or by unilateral action. But simultaneously with that, I think you engage, you work together, you train together. And we started on stuff like submarine rescue and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, some of the non-controversial things. But I think that, well, I'll go back to the previous answer. We want China to be a great country, but we want them to take the responsibilities of a great country. And you can't do that if you're making territorial claims that are just outlandish. And you can't do that because those territorial claims are not against us, but they're against the Philippines, they're against Brunei, they're against Malaysia, they're against Vietnam, they're against their neighbors. And if you get into that sort of thing, then the chances for friction, the chances for that an accident will cause something bad to happen just go way, way up.
Good question. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks and your efforts to make a more inclusive Navy and Marine Corps. I'm a master's student at the Harris School. You touched earlier on the difficulties of recruiting for today's military. It seems one of the things you would want is it to be a pathway to success on the other side of your 4 years or 8 years. And it seems, in my limited experience, the military is very good at making Marines and soldiers and airmen, but not quite as good as transitioning them back into civilian life, like anything the resources students get outside of college, leaving a four-year institution like this. So how do we make sure that those individuals are integrated successfully back into society?
Great point, and it's one of the things I spent a lot of time working on. The Navy and Marine Corps have gotten better at it. The Marine Corps now, when you get out or when you're beginning to get out, they offer different pathways. You can do the entrepreneurial thing. They'll help you learn how to set up a business. You can do more education. You can do an apprenticeship track, this sort of thing. The Navy wants you to tell them a year in advance if you're going to get out, and then they send you through TAP, Transition Assistance Program. None of these things works as well as it should. Part of it is on the military in terms of getting people out correctly, but part of it is also in the private sector. I mean, the skills that Marines learn, for example, you'd be astounded at the number of Marines who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. It's the largest single group anywhere. The leadership skills, the technical skills that people in the military learn ought to be in great demand. And I don't think there's enough of I don't think the military and the private sector are lashed up enough in those terms. Some of it is just very straightforward. Do you know what a corpsman is?
Medic, as Marine.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Who knows what a corpsman is? Okay. A corpsman is a medic. A corpsman is a Navy medic who serves with the Marines. But nobody knows that term. And one of the things that I tried to do was change some of those terms and also change the qualifications, because a corpsman coming out should be able to walk across the street and get a job as an EMT right away. But because our standards were different than a lot of state standards, they couldn't. And so we were trying to line that up. We have 5 different aircraft maintenance specialties in the Navy. And they're very specialized, engine repair or fuselage repair or whatever. None of them line up with FAA requirements. We were trying to move to lining up our military requirements to the FAA requirements. So when somebody got out, they could go and get a job with Southwest or with American or with an airline, just like that, because they would have the piece of paper, they would have the certification. Military's got to do a better job. I know we tried really hard. I don't think we got there. But the private sector's also got to do a little bit better job of understanding who's coming out, when they're coming out, and of just talking to the military more.
You said you are a Marine? You were a Marine?
Was.
You're never a former Marine.
No. What assistance do you feel like you were missing when you transitioned out?
A little different for me being an officer, coming from a decent undergrad school and knowing I went to business school before I came here. But I attended TAP. I didn't think they did a great job of expanding on all the potential options and career paths or bringing in private sector. But I completely agree that the private sector has trouble translating a military resume into something that does fit with their company, but they just can't put the pieces together sometimes. So I think there's a divide that needs to be bridged.
Okay, thank you.
Hello again. There's an increasing amount of sort of political science literature that says foreign occupation is bad, right? It can lead to anti-American sentiment, it can lead to terrorism, what have you. A number of scholars, especially here at the University of Chicago, propose sort of this model of offshore balancing. So taking troops and bases from the ground, excuse me, and actually moving them to ships on the sea. I'm curious if there's conversations at high levels of government about this, what it would entail for the Navy, and then just to both of you, what your thoughts on offshore.
And you're talking
balancing
about from allied nations, from Europe or Japan, or are you talking about moving more of the troops that are currently in Afghanistan? Well, there is no ocean, so somewhere else.
I was talking more about the latter group, yeah.
About the latter?
Yeah.
So about, say, places of conflict?
Yes.
Okay, instead of equipment on ships, people on ships. You
Well,
remember
you
equipment
just
on ships.
described
Yeah.
the function of the Navy and Marines. We do have some overseas bases, but again in military speak,
Right.
it's places, not bases. The way I used to put it is, when we go somewhere, we can stay as long as we're needed. We bring everything with us, and we don't have to ask anybody's permission to get the job done. When President Obama in 2014 made the decision to strike ISIS, the only strike option for 54 days was a carrier. We had a carrier on station in less than 24 hours. And it wasn't because we didn't have any other airplanes in the region. We had lots of them, but the countries wouldn't let them take off armed for strike. We were taking off from sovereign U.S. territory, so we didn't have to. We didn't have to ask anybody. And I really like that notion that very flexible, very responsive, very mobile force. And again, that's pretty much a description of the Navy and Marines. Where you're going to get an argument is with the other two services that do need fixed runways and big bases and stuff like that. But the Navy and Marine are America's expeditionary forces. Their job is to get there fast, have enough of whatever you need to get the job done, and then if it is a conflict, to hold on until the much heavier forces can come in.
And sometimes they're not necessary because there's something about having 3,000 Marines floating right off of your shore that tends to focus the mind. And we saw that what did Colin Powell once say? He said the difference between the Air Force and the Marines is, by definition, the Air Force cannot float. So,
yeah, I mean, ideally, what you want to do is just what you said. You want to deter.
Yeah.
When you send a carrier strike group or an amphibious ready group with those 3,000 Marines and all the air power that comes with it and all the other things that come with it, you want people to think twice about doing whatever they were planning to do.
And it happens quite often, but I'd like to read some of the research. Maybe you could send it to me. You probably like it too, because it sounds interesting. I'm just not sure how it would work in some of our current sites of conflict. But
well, the Navy provided 40% of combat air over Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And last I looked, it wasn't a sea-based country.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Howdy. Tim Spaulding. I'm a master's student in threat and response management at the grad school. Got some notes here. Here we go. Thanks for explaining your job. I was in the Marines for 11 years and prior enlisted. Every single recruit in your tenure memorized your name. We couldn't tell you what you did, though. I couldn't tell you what you
Poor
did.
kids.
Well, it's a good start, you know.
So, just want to say thanks for explaining your job. That was a great question by that dude.
All right, I'm going to tell you a real quick story. My oldest daughter, her boyfriend's best friend joined the Marines. And he was in the recruiting depot, and he's talking to the sergeant, and my picture's up on the wall. And he said, "Hey, that's Ray Mabus. My best friend dates his daughter." And the sergeant looks and goes, "Nuh-uh."
You don't have to say what happened to him after that. I think me and him know.
One thing I promised my daughter is I wouldn't go to any base he was at and ask for him.
Yeah, he would have got a lot of crap from his buddies. But you traveled a lot. Obviously, that's a good thing. I think that shows that you care. And obviously, the Marines and the sailors would see that. But did you ever have to personally do DTS? Or,
I did.
so you know what I'm going with.
I have no clue.
Okay.
What is DTS?
Defense
Travel
Travel System.
software.
It's. I was going to ask, if it was ever brought to your attention how bad it is, and if there's anything to do to fix it.
Oh, it's one of many systems in the government that's just truly awful and a mystery as to how it works, if it does at all.
And a mystery why DOD paid some company tens of millions of dollars to write a really lousy software system.
There's a lot of four-letter words going around trying to do your own travel claim.
No,
I was just wondering
because
if anything
people that
was getting
work
done to
for
fix it.
me would have to
Yeah.
go. The Navy gave me a really nice ride
Yeah.
to get places. But no, I mean, it was astounding to me, some of these systems that just didn't work and yet wouldn't get fixed. One of the things that we had talked about earlier, there's a thing called DFAS in the Pentagon, Defense Finance and Accounting Service. It's what cuts your check.
That was going to be the second part of that question.
Well, they write the checks for the services. That's all they do. The money was appropriated to us. We gave them the money. We gave them a list. Here's who you pay. Here are the contracts. Here are the people. Here's how much we owe them. Here are the withholdings, blah, 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 blah. They charged us $300 million to write those checks my last year.
They charged the Department of the Navy
$300 million. And we couldn't get a clean audit because 9 of 10 of their internal controls just didn't work. They couldn't tell you where a lot of the money went. Why do you need that? I mean,
Why couldn't you cut your own checks? See, this is, yeah, and when the Army could cut its, what a novel idea, right? Even PACOM could cut its own checks. I mean, we can even take this down.
we
a little further.
started bypassing them, which
Yeah.
was I guess a little questionable on authorities.
Well, you're not in jail, so it must have been
but,
okay. Yeah.
And I think the statute's passed. So. But yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
astounded at how hard we make it for people sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, the second part was about stuff
It was
like
about
DFAS.
DFAS. It goes back to the G1, so being an Intel guy, I was in the 2, but most of my time had to deal with, especially my Marines, was G1 issues.
Personnel issues.
It was
Yeah.
pay, it was
Yeah.
something was messed up, the travel
Yeah.
claim didn't come through.
Yeah.
And these are junior guys who need money to
Yeah.
support families and stuff, so.
Or they'd move and, their paycheck wouldn't catch up with them for a couple of months.
So I was just asking if any of those issues that always
Yeah.
got brought up to me, and I would always bring it up, ever got brought to your attention.
And
Yeah.
it's hard. Well, another question with one is we wanted to give all the youngsters who participated in a relief effort in Burma a medal. And like months went by and I kept saying, why aren't the medals going out? What's going on with the medals? What's going on with the medals? And finally the one came up to us and he said, well, you didn't have written permission to go into Burma for the assistance effort. And we said, Laura Bush called us and asked us to go into Burma, and her husband was on the line, and we're pretty sure that that was permission to go into Burma. They would not give those young people their medals because George Bush had not signed the letter. So, I mean, just to give you guys an idea of sometimes.
I had a similar
Yeah.
example of President of the United States publicly directed me to do something. And, I mean, made a speech, said, I direct Navy to do this.
Yeah.
And so we were moving out on it, and we hit somebody in the Pentagon, a political appointee, who said, well, you don't have the authority to do that. And we said, well, the president directed us. That's not a presidential directive. To have a presidential directive, you've got to have this piece of paper and that piece of paper.
Yeah.
And my chief of staff sort of went crazy on her, went postal and said, the president of the United States said it.
Yeah.
That's good enough for me. And we eventually got it worked out. Did they ever get their medals?
No. If any of you are going, I didn't know you then. If any of you are going into the Foreign Service, it's not like that in the Foreign Service. That's the good news. We're much leaner. So that's my one. Any of you going into the Foreign Service out of curiosity? No? How about the military? Good. Good.
Also,
Thank you for your-
900,000 people in the Navy and Marines.
I know. It's a little, we've got, can't compete with our 11.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you for being here, sir. I'm Ensign Sarah Claudy. I'm currently a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy. You spoke a lot about the importance of education, but it has been my impression and experience that a lot of officers and enlisted who actually already have a higher education aren't given adequate opportunities to formally use that education within the fleet. So what changes need to be made to get a better return on investment on the educations that our sailors actually already have?
Good question.
Give me an example.
Well, so for example, personally, I graduated in 2017 from the Naval Academy, and I'm doing the immediate graduate education program. So I'll have my master's in 2019, but I won't be able to use that at the soonest 2025. And that is totally dependent on what kind of shore tour I get. So I don't even have a guarantee of being able to use it then. A lot of other officers that I know that also did IJEP have a similar experience.
Well, and there's another issue too. Coming out either the academy or ROTC and getting commissioned and then going straight to graduate school, like here, or with a Rhodes Scholarship or a Marshall or a Truman or something like that, in a lot of ways you fall behind your peers. And the military doesn't value that sort of education enough, and also doesn't get you into the right slots immediately. And that's one of the things, and I worked on this and failed more than I succeeded, because right now it's too much of a check the box. I mean, you said, are you going SWO?
Yes, sir.
Okay, surface warfare officer. You've got to be a division officer and then a department head, and before you get your first shore tour. And we're getting people to 05, 06, commander, captain level that have exactly the same experiences. And you don't need that. You need more people at embassies that
That's right.
before they become flags.
That's right.
Because
I agree.
you have so much interaction foreign. You need very different experiences when you're a junior officer, or you need to have a lot of different paths. The Marines are better at it than the Navy, but it's one of the things I try to do through promotion precepts, through just talking to the Naval Academy. And I wasn't successful there, but one thing we did put in was a career and mission program. Take 3 years off, do whatever you want to do, and when you come back, we'll roll you back so you're competing against people from 3 years later. It doesn't help you, but you're absolutely right in terms of the impact it has on the very brightest and the people you want to keep the most.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And she's an excellent example of the power of diversity and perhaps new ways that we can encourage diversity, including educational diversity and geographic diversity in the Navy of the future.
I want to mention one small thing. You graduated in 17 from the Academy. My first Army-Navy game, and by the way, I was 7-1 against Army during Army-Navy. But when at Army-Navy, the Brigade of Midshipmen, all 4,400 of them march out, and then the Corps of Cadets march out, all 4,400 of them. My very first one, the Corps of Cadets marched out, and everybody had the same uniform on. The mids marched out, the midshipmen marched out, and you could pick out the women because they had different covers, they had different hats, and different uniforms. And to me, it was a way of segregating women. It was a historical accident because women joined the military as auxiliary in World War II, and they were given different uniforms for a purpose to show that they were not part of the active duty forces. And that has continued. And so we went to one uniform, or basically one uniform for everybody. And probably got more blowback on that than any single thing I did. But when you look out, you know, you don't want to see male Marines, and female Marines, male sailors, female sailors. You want to see United States sailors. And you shouldn't be able to pick out. I mean, imagine if we had asked another group to wear different uniforms. If you were gay, or if you were a different race or ethnicity, here, you wear a different uniform. Imagine the trouble we'd be in. But we thought it was okay to do it with women.
You made women, and well, not you, but they were making women wear their hair at least an inch long in the early time of Iraq, and because they wanted to be able to tell the women from the men.
Yeah,
that really bothered me because I felt like they
I had a conversation on that because we were talking about hairstyles and you know how women could wear it, and the Marines got all wrapped around the axle
they're
on
big
that.
on hair there.
And I'm having this conversation with a colonel, and I said, okay, can you shave your head? Your woman said, no, sir. And I said, what do you mean, no? And he said, well, they have to have it at least an inch long. And I said, why? Men don't.
Exactly.
And he said, well, it'd just be weird otherwise.
Yeah.
And I said, and an inch long isn't? Really?
Yeah. And it would, Unfortunately, there are 15 seconds left, or we could continue to talk about Marine Corps hair rules, which take up 3 pages. You can read them online. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for being here today, and I want to thank all of you. I want to thank those of you who are former military and reservists right now for your service and for your questions today. And safe journeys, and thank you to all of you, and enjoy your dinners, and spring may be here finally. Thank you.
All right.